Rachel Thornton woke before dawn, as she always did, to the sound of absolute silence. No birds yet, no wind, just the heavy stillness of the New Mexico desert holding its breath before the sun rose and turned the world into an oven. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the wooden beams above her head, counting the cracks she had memorized over 18 years of waking alone. Then she pushed herself up, her joints protesting in that way they had started to a few years back, reminding her that 52 was not 20, no matter how much work still needed doing. She dressed in the dark, pulling on the same worn trousers and faded shirt she wore every day, her fingers moving through the routine without thought. There was no one to dress for, no reason to bother with anything that might be called vanity. The mirror on her dresser was dusty, and she avoided looking at it most mornings. What was the point? The woman who stared back at her was a stranger anyway. All lines and sun damage and grey streaking through hair that had once been the colour of autumn wheat. Outside, the air was cooler than it would be in a few hours, and Rachel breathed it in deeply, letting it fill her lungs. The ranch stretched out before her in the pre-dawn light. 70 acres of scrub and dust and stubborn hope. The barn needed repairs. The fence along the southern property line was sagging again. The well pump had been making a grinding noise for weeks that she kept meaning to fix, but never quite got around to. It was too much for one person, and she knew it, but hiring hands cost money she did not have, and selling out would mean admitting that her husband had died for nothing. She walked to the barn and fed the 8 cattle she had left, watching them eat with the same dull patience they showed every day. They were thin. The grass was thin. Everything about this place was thin, stretched too far, barely holding on. Like her. By mid-morning the heat was brutal, and Rachel saddled her horse to ride out to the southern fence. It was a long ride, almost 2 hours, and she brought water and her rifle, though she had not fired it at anything living in years. The Apache had been quiet lately, which meant either they had moved on or they were planning something. The town said she was a fool for staying out here alone, that a woman her age should have sense enough to move closer to civilization. But Rachel had stopped listening to the town a long time ago. The desert shimmered around her as she rode, heat rising in waves that distorted the horizon. She passed the place where she and Thomas had once talked about building a second barn, back when they still believed the ranch would grow, that they would have children to pass it on to. That dream had died slowly, month by month, as her body refused to give him what they both wanted. And then he had died, and she was left with nothing but land and regret. She found the Apache warrior near the southern fence line, collapsed in the shade of a Joshua tree, his face grey with pain and his shirt soaked through with blood. For a moment, Rachel just sat on her horse, staring down at him, her mind racing through every possible outcome of this moment. If she helped him, the town would call her a traitor. If she left him, he would die, and she would have to live with that. If she brought him back to the ranch, she might be signing her own death warrant. But there was something in the way he looked at her, even through his pain. Not pleading, not begging, just watching, as if he already knew what she would choose and was waiting to see if he was right. Rachel dismounted. She pulled her canteen from the saddle and knelt beside him, her knees protesting against the hard ground. She lifted his head carefully, her hand cradling the back of his skull, and brought the canteen to his lips. He drank, his eyes never leaving hers, and when he was done, he said something in Apache that she did not understand, but that sounded like gratitude. The bullet wound in his side was bad, but not fatal if she could stop the bleeding. She tore strips from the hem of her shirt, ignoring the fact that it left her midriff exposed to the sun, and bound the wound as tightly as she could. He hissed in pain but did not pull away, and she found herself murmuring to him the way she used to murmur to Thomas when he was sick, meaningless reassurances that probably sounded just as empty in Apache as they did in English. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her hands sticky with his blood, and wondered what she had just done. He was strong enough to sit up now, leaning against the tree trunk, and he said something else she did not understand. Then he reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small carved stone, a bird of some kind, and pressed it into her palm. She tried to give it back, but he closed her fingers around it and shook his head. Rachel helped him to his feet, though he was taller than her and heavier, and she could feel the heat of his body through his shirt. He was young, maybe 25, and there was something about his face that reminded her of her own stubbornness, the same refusal to give up even when giving up was the smart thing to do. She pointed toward the east, away from her ranch, and he nodded. Then he walked into the desert without looking back, and she watched him until he disappeared into the heat shimmer. She rode home slowly, her mind turning over what she had done, the carved stone heavy in her pocket. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in bed and listened to the silence and wondered if she had just made the worst mistake of her life. 3 days later, she woke to a sound she had never heard before. Not silence, not wind, something else. She got out of bed and walked to the window, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion, and looked out at her land. They were everywhere. Apache warriors, hundreds of them, arranged in a silent circle around her ranch. They sat on their horses utterly still, and in the early morning light they looked like shadows, like ghosts, like something out of a fever dream. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had no gun within reach, no way to defend herself, no way to run. If you were this woman, living alone for years, would you open your door and face 300 warriors, knowing that one wrong move could end everything? Rachel dressed with shaking hands, her mind blank with fear and something else, something that felt almost like acceptance. She had always known the desert would kill her eventually. She just had not expected it to look like this. She walked to the front door, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and opened it. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were almost too beautiful to bear, and standing at the front of that circle of warriors was a man she did not recognize, but somehow knew. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with scars across his face and arms and a bearing that spoke of command, of respect, of a life lived at the edge of violence. He dismounted and walked toward her, and Rachel made herself stand still even though every instinct screamed at her to run. He stopped a few feet from her porch and said something in Apache. Then he gestured to the young man she had saved, who stepped forward from the circle, his wound clearly healing, his eyes meeting hers with something that might have been gratitude or respect, or both. The older man spoke again, and this time he used a few English words, broken and heavily accented but understandable. Honor, debt, protect. Rachel's throat was dry. She tried to speak and found she could not. The older man reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a bundle wrapped in leather. He stepped onto her porch, close enough that she could smell sage and smoke and sweat, and handed it to her. Inside was food. Dried meat, corn, something that looked like pemmican. Enough to last weeks. He said something else, and though she did not understand all the words, she understood the meaning. He was offering her protection. His warriors would watch over her land, keep her safe, because she had saved his son. It was a debt of honor, and he would not leave until it was repaid. Rachel looked out at the circle of warriors, at the rising sun, at the impossible situation she had stumbled into, and felt something shift inside her. For 18 years, she had been alone. For 18 years, she had convinced herself that she preferred it that way, that needing no one was the same as being strong. But standing here, with this man's eyes on her and his son's life saved by her hands, she realized how profoundly lonely she had been. She nodded. She did not know what else to do. The older man, whose name she would later learn was Nietzsche, nodded back. Then he returned to his horse, and the warriors remained, a silent circle of protection that should have terrified her, but somehow did not. Over the next few days, Rachel learned to live with her new reality. The warriors did not approach the house, but they were always there, watching, waiting. Nietzsche came to her door each morning and evening, bringing food, checking on her, speaking in his broken English while she tried to piece together his meaning. His son, whose name was Ashki, came too, his wound healing quickly, and he helped her repair the fence she had been meaning to fix for months. Rachel found herself watching them. These men who moved through her land with a confidence she had forgotten was possible. Naiche was quiet, his face hard to read, but there was a gentleness in the way he handed her things, in the way he made sure she had enough water, enough food. Ashki was lighter, quicker to smile, and he tried to teach her Apache words that she promptly forgot. They were so different from Thomas, from the men in town, from anyone she had ever known, and yet there was something about their presence that made her feel safer than she had in years. One evening, as the sun was setting and the heat finally breaking, Naiche came to her porch and gestured for her to follow him. She hesitated, but something in his face made her trust him, and she walked with him to the edge of her property, where a small fire had been built. The warriors were gathered there, and as she approached, they parted to let her through. Naiche said something in Apache, and they responded in unison, their voices low and rhythmic. Then he turned to her and spoke in English, slowly, carefully. He told her that his son had been shot by men from the railroad, men who wanted Apache land and did not care who they killed to get it. He told her that the railroad was coming closer, that soon they would want her land too, and that when they did, they would not ask nicely. He told her that he and his warriors would stay until the threat was gone, until she was safe, because that was the honorable thing to do. And then he told her something else, something that made her breath catch. He said that she reminded him of his wife, who had died many years ago, that she had the same stubbornness, the same refusal to bend, that saving his son had shown him something he had almost forgotten, that there was still kindness in the world, still mercy, still people worth protecting. Rachel did not know what to say. She stood there, surrounded by warriors, by fire, by the vast emptiness of the desert, and felt tears prick at her eyes. She had not cried in years. She had trained herself not to, but something about this moment, about this man's words, cracked the careful shell she had built around herself. That night, she lay in bed and listened to the sound of voices outside, low and warm and alive, and realized that she was not alone anymore. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was everything she had not known she needed. The railroad men came a week later, 6 of them on horseback, led by a man named Clayton, who wore a suit that looked absurd in the desert heat. They rode up to her house with the confidence of men who had never been told no, and Clayton dismounted with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He told her that the railroad was expanding, that they needed her land, that they were prepared to make her a generous offer. When she refused, his smile faded. He told her that a woman alone had no business running a ranch, that she was being unreasonable, that if she did not sell, they would find other ways to persuade her. And then he noticed the warriors, still camped in a circle around her property, and his face went pale. Rachel watched as Clayton tried to bluster, tried to threaten, tried to pretend he was not afraid. But Naiche stepped forward, and the look on his face was enough to make Clayton back toward his horse. Naiche did not speak. He did not need to. The message was clear. Touch her, and you die. Clayton and his men left, but Rachel knew they would be back. Men like that always came back. She told Naiche as much, and he nodded, his face grim. Then he said something that surprised her. He said that he and Ashki would stay at the house, close enough to protect her if the railroad men returned at night. She started to protest, to say that it was not necessary, but he cut her off with a look that said he had already made up his mind. That night, Naiche and Ashki slept on her porch, wrapped in blankets, their rifles close at hand. Rachel lay in bed and listened to the sound of their breathing, the low murmur of their voices when they spoke to each other, and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt safe, but more than that, she felt seen. These men, who owed her nothing, who came from a world so different from hers, had chosen to protect her, and in doing so, they had given her back a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. The days blurred together after that. Nietzsche and Ashki became a constant presence, helping her with the work she could not do alone, teaching her things she had never thought to learn. Ashki showed her how to track animals, how to read the desert, how to move silently through the scrub. Nietzsche taught her Apache words, his voice patient when she stumbled over the pronunciation, and she found herself looking forward to those lessons, to the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when she got something right. There were moments, small and fleeting, when Rachel felt the boundaries between them begin to blur. Nietzsche's hand on her shoulder when she was upset, Ashki's laugh when she made a joke. The way they both looked at her, not as a burden or a duty, but as someone worth knowing. She had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at that way. One afternoon, she was in the kitchen trying to fix the broken handle on a pot when Nietzsche came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her struggle, and then he crossed the room and took the pot from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, warm and rough and strong, and Rachel felt a jolt run through her that had nothing to do with surprise. He fixed the handle in seconds, his hands moving with a confidence that made her realize how capable he was, how much he had been holding back to let her keep her independence. When he handed the pot back to her, their eyes met, and Rachel saw something there that made her heart pound. It was not pity, it was not duty, it was desire, raw and unmistakable, and she realized with a shock that she wanted him too. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she was past wanting, that her body was too old, too worn, too marked by time to be desirable. But the way Nietzsche looked at her told her she was wrong. She stepped back, her breath coming too fast, and he let her go. But the air between them had changed, and they both knew it. That night, Rachel could not sleep. She lay in bed and thought about Nietzsche, about the way his hands had felt against hers, about the heat in his eyes. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had built and lost, and she wondered if it was a betrayal to want someone else. But then she thought about how long she had been alone, how many nights she had spent wishing for touch, for warmth, for the simple comfort of another body beside hers, and she realized that wanting was not a betrayal. It was a gift. The next morning, she found Nietzsche outside, repairing the barn door. She stood beside him, not speaking, just watching the way his muscles moved under his shirt, the way the sun caught the grey in his hair. He glanced at her, and she saw the question in his eyes. She did not answer with words. She just reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light against his skin, and felt him go still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Nietzsche set down his tools and turned to face her fully. He said something in Apache, his voice low and rough, and even though she did not understand the words, she understood the meaning. He was asking permission. He was giving her the choice. Rachel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, and looked up into his eyes. She had forgotten how tall he was, how solid. She had forgotten what it felt like to be this close to someone, to feel the pull of attraction so strong it made her dizzy. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, and he closed his eyes, his breath hitching. She did not know who moved first. Maybe it was her, maybe it was him, but suddenly they were kissing, and it was nothing like the kisses she remembered from her youth. It was deeper, slower, more intense, as if they were both trying to pour years of loneliness into this one moment. His hands came up to cradle her face, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his palms, and Rachel felt something inside her break open, something she had kept locked away for so long she had forgotten it was there. When they finally pulled apart, she was shaking. Nietzsche rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips, and whispered something in Apache that sounded like a prayer. Rachel did not need a translation. She felt it too. Over the next few weeks, Rachel found herself falling into a rhythm with Nietzsche and Ashki that felt more natural than anything she had known in years. They worked the ranch together. the three of them moving in silent coordination. And at night, they sat around the fire and talked, their words a mix of English and Apache and gestures that bridged the gap between languages. Ashki teased her gently, his youth and energy infectious, and Naiche watched her with eyes that held a tenderness she had not expected. There were more moments like the one in the barn, stolen touches and kisses that left her breathless. Naiche was careful with her, always asking, always waiting for her to come to him, and Rachel found that she appreciated his restraint even as she ached for more. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with desire, since anyone had made her feel like she was still a woman and not just a ghost haunting her own life. One night, after Ashki had gone to sleep, Rachel and Naiche sat on the porch together, the desert stretching out before them under a sky full of stars. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and felt his arm come around her, pulling her close. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence was enough. But the peace could not last forever. Clayton returned with more men, a dozen of them this time, all armed. They rode up to the ranch at midday, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, and Clayton dismounted with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He told Rachel that this was her last chance, that the railroad would not be denied, that if she did not sell, they would take her land by force. Naiche stepped forward, his hand on his rifle, and the tension in the air became unbearable. Rachel could see Clayton's men shifting nervously, their eyes on the Apache warriors who had appeared as if from nowhere, surrounding the ranch house. There were more of them now, she realized. Word had spread, and the Apache had sent reinforcements. Clayton was outnumbered, and he knew it. But Clayton was not stupid. He smiled, that same cold smile, and told Rachel that this was not over, that the railroad had resources she could not imagine, that they would find a way to get what they wanted. And then he and his men rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the promise of violence to come. Rachel felt Naiche's hand on her shoulder, grounding her, and she turned to look at him. His face was hard, but his eyes were worried. He knew, as she did, that the railroad would come back, and when they did, people would die. That night, Rachel made a decision. She called Naiche and Ashki into her house and told them that she could not let them risk their lives for her land, that it was not worth it, that she would sell to the railroad if it meant keeping them safe. Naiche listened in silence, his face unreadable, and when she was done, he spoke. He told her that this was not about land. It was about honor. It was about refusing to let men like Clayton take whatever they wanted just because they could. He told her that the Apache had been fighting that same fight for generations, and that they would not stop now. He told her that she was worth fighting for, that her stubbornness and her courage had earned their respect, and that they would stand with her no matter what came. Rachel felt tears streaming down her face, and she did not try to stop them. Ashki stepped forward and took her hand, squeezing it gently, and Naiche pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She had spent so many years believing that she had to be strong alone, that needing help was weakness. But in that moment, surrounded by these men who had chosen to stand with her, she realized that true strength was not about refusing help. It was about accepting it. The railroad men came back a week later, but this time they brought an army. 50 men, maybe more, all armed and ready for a fight. They surrounded the ranch at dawn, and Clayton rode forward with a white flag, calling for Rachel to come out. She stepped onto the porch, Naiche and Ashki flanking her, and looked out at the sea of guns pointed at her home. Clayton made his final offer: sell now, or watch everything burn. Rachel looked at Naiche, at Ashki, at the warriors who had gathered to protect her, and she made her choice. She told Clayton no. What happened next was chaos. The railroad men opened fire, and the Apache responded in kind. Rachel dove for cover, her heart pounding, and felt Naiche pull her behind the porch railing, his body shielding hers. Bullets splintered the wood above her head, and she could hear men shouting, horses screaming, the sharp crack of rifles firing over and over. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced, and yet there was a part of her that felt strangely calm. She was not alone. She was not fighting this battle by herself. The fight lasted hours, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning in the smoke and noise and fear. But eventually, the railroad men broke. They had not expected the Apache to fight so fiercely, had not expected to lose so many men. Clayton retreated with what was left of his force, and the Apache warriors let them go, their message clear. Touch this woman again, and there will be no mercy. When the dust settled, Rachel stood on her porch and looked out at her land, at the bodies lying in the dirt, at the blood soaking into the ground. She felt Nietzsche's hand in hers, his grip steady and strong, and she turned to look at him. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm, but he was alive. Apache was alive. The ranch was still standing. They buried the dead that evening, all of them, railroad men and Apache warriors alike. It was Nietzsche's idea, and Rachel understood why. Death was death, no matter which side you fought on. And honoring the dead was a way of acknowledging the cost of survival. That night, Rachel sat with Nietzsche by the fire, her body exhausted, her mind numb. He cleaned and bandaged his wound, his movements slow and careful, and she watched him in silence. When he was done, he looked at her, and she saw everything she felt reflected in his eyes. The fear, the relief, the gratitude that they were both still alive. She reached for him, and he came to her, pulling her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her like he would never let go. They sat there, holding each other, and Rachel felt something shift inside her, something that had been frozen for so long finally beginning to thaw. She kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. She needed him in a way that went beyond words, beyond reason, and he needed her just as much. They moved inside, away from the fire, away from the watchful eyes of the warriors. Rachel's hands shook as she unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers trembling against his skin, and Nietzsche caught her wrists gently, stilling her. He said her name, his voice rough and low, and she looked up at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. He was asking again, making sure, giving her one more chance to pull back. But Rachel did not want to pull back. She wanted to feel alive. She wanted to remember what it was like to be touched, to be desired, to be more than just a woman surviving. She wanted to be a woman living. What happened next was not rushed or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, a careful exploration of bodies that had both been marked by time and hardship. Nietzsche touched her like she was something precious, his hands tracing the lines of her face, her neck, her shoulders, and Rachel found herself trembling under his attention. She had forgotten how good it felt to be touched this way, with reverence and desire mixed together. She had forgotten that her body could still respond, still ache, still want. They moved together in the darkness, their breathing the only sound, and Rachel felt years of loneliness and grief and shame begin to peel away. She was not too old. She was not used up. She was here, alive, wanted, and that was enough. Afterward they lay tangled together, Nietzsche's arms around her, her head on his chest, and Rachel listened to the steady beat of his heart. She felt tears on her cheeks, but they were not sad tears. They were tears of relief, of release, of finally letting go of the belief that she did not deserve this. Nietzsche kissed her forehead, his lips warm against her skin, and whispered something in Apache that she wished she could understand. But maybe understanding was not the point. Maybe feeling was enough. The next morning, Rachel woke to find Nietzsche already up, standing by the window, looking out at the land. She joined him, slipping her hand into his, and he squeezed her fingers gently. The warriors were beginning to pack up, she realized. Their job was done. The debt was paid. They would leave and she would be alone again. Except she would not be alone. Nietzsche turned to her, his face serious, and told her that he and Apache would stay if she wanted them. that they could build something here, together, if she was willing. That the Apache had land to the north, and if the railroad came back, they would fight again. But this time, they would have a place to retreat to, a home to defend. He was offering her a future she had never imagined, a life that was more than just survival. Rachel looked at him, at this man who had come into her life because of a single act of mercy, and felt something bloom in her chest. Hope. She had not felt hope in so long she had forgotten what it tasted like. But now it was here, bright and fierce and impossible to ignore. She said yes. Of course, she said yes. The months that followed were not easy. Building a life with someone was never easy, especially when that someone came from a different world. But Rachel and Nietzsche learned to navigate their differences, to find common ground, to build something that belonged to both of them. Ashki stayed too, becoming like a son to her, and the ranch slowly began to thrive again. The Apache warriors came and went, bringing trade, bringing stories, bringing a sense of community that Rachel had not known in years. There were nights when she and Nietzsche sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the desert, and she marveled at how much her life had changed. She was no longer the woman who had woken up alone every morning, counting cracks in the ceiling, waiting for death. She was a woman who laughed, who loved, who had found her place in the world again. She was a woman who had learned that it was never too late to start over, that desire did not fade with age, but deepened, that mercy was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. And when Nietzsche pulled her close, his arms strong and warm around her, Rachel closed her eyes and let herself feel it all. The heat of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the knowledge that she was no longer alone, that she had survived, that she had found her way home. If this story touched your heart, stay close. There are many more nights under western skies waiting for you.